I would be saying, I mean, number one, why are we skipping animal studies with these vaccines? We know the history of the coronavirus vaccine. Coronavirus vaccines in the past have shown themselves to be very, very dangerous vaccines, very volatile vaccines. And I'll explain to you why that's so. In 2002, beginning in 2002, there were 3 SARS epidemics. And these are, SARS is a coronavirus. The first of those was a natural occurring coronavirus that jumped from bats in China to human beings. The second 2 were lab-created coronaviruses that escaped from the lab and caused these epidemics. And that's non-controversial, and everybody, agrees with that. But there was deep concern about the transmissibility and the virulence of coronavirus and its capacity to jump from animals to human beings. So all of the major nations, Western nations and China, got together in between 2006 and 2012 to create coronavirus vaccines. They created about 30 vaccines, and they chose the 4 most promising ones. This was a consortium of the best scientists, virologists, and immunologists in the world. They gave those 4 vaccines to ferrets, and ferrets are the closest analogy when it comes to upper respiratory infections to human beings. So they're heavily utilized to study coronavirus. Ferrets had an excellent immune response to the vaccines, meaning they developed antibodies. And that's the metric that FDA uses when it licenses a vaccine. It just looks and says, is it producing antibody? Vaccines are never tested in the field, Patrick. Nobody ever gives 5,000 people a vaccine and 5,000 people no vaccine and then sends them out and sees what happens. That's not how they get licensed. They get licensed by showing that they can produce antibodies. And the presumption is that that antibody will defend you against future attacks by that virus. And so the ferrets developed a really good antibody response, and they thought they had 4 winners here. But then something really frightening happened. When those ferrets were exposed to the wild virus, they had developed horrible inflammation throughout all the organs on their bodies, and they died, particularly in their lungs, and they died. And then those scientists remembered that the same thing had happened when they had tried an RSV vaccine in the 1960s on children. They had RSV, which was very similar to coronavirus, upper respiratory infection, and they had given it to they skipped animal studies. They gave it to 35 kids, and it was provoked excellent immune response. But then when those kids were exposed to the wild virus, they became horribly sick, and 2 of them died. And they immediately discontinued that study, and it was a scandal. Everybody remembered it. And in 2012, when they were testing all of these vaccines, they said to themselves on ferrets, they said, this is what happened to those children. We tried it out and they developed antibody response, but then they had what we call paradoxical immune enhancement, that when they were exposed to the real virus, instead of protecting against it, it actually enhanced it, and it made it much more deadly. And then they connected it in 2014 to the dengue vaccine, which was one of Tony Fauci's vaccines, which had a lot of those same red flags during the clinical trials. But they gave it to the Filipinos anyway. The Philippines gave it to hundreds of thousands of kids. The kids were great immune response, and then when they were exposed to the wild virus, they died. 600 of them died. And the Philippine government today is prosecuting criminally, putting people in jail for that, because they knew it. They knew something bad was going to happen from the clinical trials. And so this is something that is a unique peculiarity of coronavirus. And it's puzzling that Tony Fauci, on his own vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, which his agency owns 50% of that vaccine, and they went right to human testing without testing on animals. And that just seems almost criminally irresponsible. And he's allowing the same thing. Oh, I would ask him, knowing that history. And by the way, it's not just me saying this. All the people who have criticized me for my stance on vaccines for many years, the leaders like Peter Hotez and Paul Offit and Ian Lipkin are all saying the same thing that I'm saying to you right now. You have to be really, really careful with the coronavirus vaccine. Reason is that vaccines develop a immune response, but they develop different kinds. There are two different kinds of antibodies, and this is what they found out from this process. There's neutralizing antibodies, which you want your body to produce, and that guards you against the disease. And those are good antibodies. But they also produce a specific species of antibodies called blinding antibodies. And those are the ones that provoke an enhanced immune response once you're exposed to the vaccine. And you have to figure out, which one of those you're actually producing. And it's unclear that the way you do that is by testing it on animals. And they're not doing that in this case. The other thing that they're not doing is they're not using placebo testing, which means nobody will ever know what the risk profile is for those products. If you don't test against placebo, you don't know whether the people who became ill in that cohort that received the vaccine became ill because of the vaccine or it's just coincidental. There's no way to know, and so they don't even record it. And it immediately creates opportunities for bias, for corruption, and for cheating if you do not use placebo. And that's why the World Health Organization, CDC, FDA, NIH, everybody says, if you don't use a placebo, it's not science, it's marketing. And that's what they're doing. They're doing all of these tests without using placebo. And I would say to Anthony Fauci, why aren't you using a placebo group? Are you scared about what is going to be shown about safety if you actually use a true placebo group? It's completely irresponsible.
When you look at the data and the media shows approval rating of Fauci against Trump, and they constantly show that America trusts Fauci